On the morning of August 5, 1981, a man named Jonathan Pierce stood in his bathroom in McLean, Virginia, staring at his reflection in the mirror while an electric shaver buzzed against his jawline. He was 42 years old, looked 50, and felt closer to 60. The house around him was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. His wife Patricia had left 3 months earlier, taking their daughter Emily to her mother's house in Baltimore after what she called his final betrayal, which was not infidelity or drinking or any of the usual domestic failures, but rather his refusal to tell her what he actually did for a living. She had known when they married in 1967 that he worked for the government, something vague in the State Department, he had said, and for 14 years she had accepted the careful evasions, the unexplained absences, the phone calls at strange hours that sent him driving into Washington at 2 in the morning. But by the spring of 1981, she had stopped accepting anything. She wanted the truth or she wanted out. And when Jonathan explained that he could not give her the truth even if he wanted to, even if it cost him everything, she had packed 2 suitcases and walked out the front door without looking back. Jonathan turned off the shaver and splashed cold water on his face. The reflection staring back at him belonged to a man who had spent 21 years working for the Central Intelligence Agency, first as an analyst in the Soviet Estimates Office, then as a case officer in the Operations Directorate, and for the past 6 years as a senior operations officer specializing in technical intelligence and Soviet scientific espionage. He had recruited assets, run agents, managed dead drops in Moscow and East Berlin and Prague. He had lied to foreign nationals, manipulated vulnerable people into betraying their countries, and authorized surveillance operations that violated every principle he had been taught to respect as an American citizen. And he had done all of it, he told himself, because someone had to, because the Cold War was not a metaphor or an abstraction, but a genuine existential threat. And because if people like him did not do this work, people like his daughter would grow up in a world where freedom was something that existed only in history books. He dried his face with a towel and walked downstairs to the kitchen where the coffee maker was already brewing, set on a timer the night before. It was 6:17 in the morning. He had a meeting at Langley at 8:30 with William Casey, the Director of Central Intelligence, and 2 senior officials from the National Security Council staff. The meeting concerned a document that had arrived from Paris 3 days earlier, delivered through channels so sensitive that only 11 people in the entire United States government knew it existed. Jonathan had been one of those 11 people since August 2nd, when Thomas Reed, a special assistant to the president on the NSC staff, had called him into a windowless conference room on the 7th floor and placed a blue-bordered folder in front of him with the word Kudo stamped across the cover in red ink. Jonathan had opened the folder and spent the next 4 hours reading material that would later be described by historians as one of the most significant intelligence windfalls of the entire Cold War, although at the time, sitting in that conference room with Reed watching him from across the table, Jonathan had no sense of historical significance. He had only a growing sense of horror at what the documents revealed. The folder contained photocopies of approximately 4,000 pages of classified Soviet documents provided by a source the French intelligence service, the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, had code named Farewell. The source was a 52-year-old Soviet engineer named Vladimir Vetrov, a colonel in the KGB who worked in Directorate T, the section responsible for stealing Western technology to bridge the gap between Soviet scientific capabilities and those of NATO countries. Vetrov had become disillusioned with the Soviet system sometime in 1980 and had volunteered his services to French intelligence for reasons that remained unclear but appeared to be primarily ideological. Between early 1981 and the summer of that year, he had systematically photographed documents from his office at KGB headquarters in Moscow, providing the French with a comprehensive overview of Soviet technical intelligence operations worldwide. What the documents showed was staggering in scope and sophistication. The Soviet Union had been conducting a massive, coordinated campaign to steal Western technology for at least a decade, possibly longer. The campaign was not opportunistic or haphazard. It was organized, methodical, and extraordinarily successful. Directorate T maintained detailed shopping lists of technologies the Soviet military-industrial complex needed, everything from computer hardware and software to aerospace components, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, telecommunication systems, radar technology, and advanced materials science. The documents identified more than 200 KGB and GRU officers operating under diplomatic cover in Western countries whose primary mission was to acquire these technologies through whatever means necessary: bribery, blackmail, cultivation of academic contacts, exploitation of commercial relationships, or outright theft. The farewell material included reports on specific operations that had successfully penetrated American corporations, universities, and government laboratories. One document described how a KGB officer posing as a trade representative had cultivated a relationship with an engineer at a Massachusetts defense contractor and obtained specifications for radar components used in F-15 fighter aircraft. Another detailed how Soviet agents had pieced together classified information about American satellite reconnaissance systems by systematically collecting unclassified technical papers published by scientists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and cross-referencing them with data obtained through human sources. A third described a network of front companies in Austria and Switzerland that purchased dual-use technologies from American suppliers and trans-shipped them to Moscow, bypassing export control regulations. The scale of the theft was breathtaking. According to the documents, the Soviet Union had acquired between 70 and 90% of its most critical military technologies from Western sources, primarily the United States, saving billions of rubles in research and development costs and allowing Soviet weapons programs to advance far more rapidly than would have been possible through indigenous efforts alone. The implications were profound and deeply disturbing. It meant that for years, possibly decades, American taxpayers had been funding Soviet military modernization through the theft of technology developed at enormous expense by American companies and research institutions. It meant that billions of dollars spent on defense research were effectively subsidizing the adversary. And it meant that the technological advantage the United States had assumed it maintained over the Soviet Union was far narrower than intelligence estimates had suggested, because the Soviets had been systematically stealing the fruits of American innovation and reverse engineering them for military applications. Jonathan had read through the entire farewell dossier twice that first day, taking notes, highlighting passages, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he was seeing. When he finished, Reed had asked him a single question. "What do we do with this?" Jonathan had thought for a long moment before answering. The obvious response would be to use the information to identify and expel Soviet intelligence officers operating in the West, to arrest their sources, to shut down the networks that had been stealing American technology. But that approach, Jonathan had argued, would waste the opportunity the farewell dossier represented. If the CIA simply rolled up the networks, the Soviets would know they had been compromised, would pull back, regroup, and establish new operations using different methods and different officers. Within a year or two, they would be back to stealing Western technology with the same efficiency they had demonstrated before, and the West would be no better off than it had been. There was, Jonathan suggested, a better way to exploit the intelligence. If the CIA knew what technologies the Soviets were trying to steal, and if the CIA knew which channels they were using to acquire those technologies, then the CIA could use that knowledge to feed the Soviets exactly what the agency wanted them to have. Not genuine technology, but modified technology. hardware and software that looked authentic, that would pass initial inspection, that would be accepted by Soviet engineers as legitimate acquisitions, but that contained hidden flaws, subtle errors in design or programming that would cause the technology to fail when it was put into operational use. It would be a massive disinformation campaign, a systematic effort to sabotage Soviet military programs by corrupting the stolen technology they depended on. Reed had listened without interrupting, and when Jonathan finished, Reed had said he would take the idea to Casey and see what the director thought. 3 days later, Jonathan was sitting in his kitchen drinking coffee and preparing to attend the meeting where Casey would decide whether to approve the operation. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the dishwasher. He put on his suit jacket, checked his briefcase to make sure he had the notes he had prepared, and walked out to his car, a 1979 Ford LTD that needed new brake pads and probably a new transmission within the next 6 months. He drove east on Dolly Madison Boulevard toward the George Washington Memorial Parkway, merging into the flow of morning commuters heading into Washington. The drive to Langley took 23 minutes in light traffic, and Jonathan spent most of that time thinking about Patricia and Emily, wondering if there was any realistic chance of repairing what had been broken, knowing there probably was not. He parked in the main employee lot at CIA headquarters, showed his credentials at the security checkpoint, and took the elevator to the 7th floor, where Casey maintained his office. Thomas Reed was already there when Jonathan arrived, along with Gus Weiss, a mild-mannered economist who worked on the NSC staff and had been cleared to read the farewell material because of his expertise in technology transfer issues. Casey was late, which was typical. He arrived at 8:42, apologized briefly, and gestured for everyone to sit. Casey was 68 years old, a veteran of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, a successful Wall Street lawyer, and a close confidant of President Reagan. He had been appointed Director of Central Intelligence in January of 1981 with a mandate to rebuild the agency after years of damage inflicted by congressional investigations, budget cuts, and a series of embarrassing intelligence failures. Casey was a hardliner on the Soviet Union, deeply convinced that the Cold War was a struggle the United States could win if it was willing to be ruthless and creative. He was also, according to people who worked with him, a man who valued operational audacity over bureaucratic caution, which made him the ideal person to champion an operation as unconventional as the one Jonathan was about to propose. Casey opened the meeting by asking Jonathan to summarize the farewell material for the benefit of Weiss, who had been briefed on the broad outlines but had not yet read the complete dossier. Jonathan walked through the key points, explaining the structure of Directorate T, the scope of Soviet technical espionage, the shopping lists of technologies the Soviets were targeting, and the networks they had established to acquire those technologies. When he finished, Casey turned to Weiss and asked what he thought. Weiss said it was the most comprehensive picture of Soviet technology theft he had ever seen, and that it presented an extraordinary opportunity for the United States to turn the tables on Moscow. Casey nodded and turned back to Jonathan. "Explain your idea," he said. Jonathan laid it out methodically. The farewell material included detailed shopping lists of technologies the Soviets wanted to acquire over the next several years. It identified the front companies, the trade representatives, the academic contacts, and the diplomatic channels they were using to acquire those technologies. It provided, in effect, a roadmap of Soviet procurement operations. If the CIA could identify which specific items on the shopping lists were being actively pursued, the agency could work with American companies and research institutions to modify those items before they reached Soviet hands. The modifications would be subtle, invisible to casual inspection, but catastrophic in operational use. Software could be programmed with hidden bugs that would cause systems to crash or malfunction under specific conditions. hardware could be manufactured with components that would fail prematurely or produce unreliable results. Technical specifications could be altered in ways that would lead Soviet engineers to design systems with built-in weaknesses. The beauty of the operation, Jonathan argued, was its deniability and its sustainability. The Soviets would have no way of knowing which technologies had been compromised and which had not. Every piece of stolen technology would become suspect. They would waste enormous resources trying to debug systems that had been deliberately sabotaged, and they would lose confidence in their entire procurement operation. Over time, the cumulative effect would be devastating. Soviet weapons programs would be delayed, degraded, or rendered entirely ineffective because they were built on a foundation of corrupted technology. Casey asked how the operation would be structured. Jonathan explained that it would require close coordination between the CIA, the FBI, and American companies willing to cooperate. The FBI would handle domestic aspects, identifying which companies were being targeted by Soviet procurement agents and working with them to provide modified products. The CIA would handle overseas operations, ensuring that technologies reaching the Soviet Union through third-country channels were also compromised. A small, highly compartmented team would manage the operation to minimize the risk of leaks or detection. Weiss interjected with a question about the legal and ethical implications. Was it appropriate for the United States government to manipulate commercial transactions, even if the ultimate recipients were Soviet intelligence services? Would American companies cooperate if they knew their products were being deliberately sabotaged? Were there risks that modified technologies might end up in civilian applications where they could cause harm to innocent people? Jonathan acknowledged the concerns but argued that the strategic benefits outweighed the risks. The technologies being targeted were dual-use items with clear military applications. The Soviet Union was stealing them for military purposes, and the United States had every right to defend itself against that theft. As for civilian harm, the modifications would be designed to affect only systems used in military or intelligence contexts, and safeguards could be built in to minimize collateral damage. Casey listened carefully, asked a few more questions, and then leaned back in his chair. He said he liked the idea. He said it was exactly the kind of aggressive, creative operation the agency needed to be running. He said he would take it to President Reagan for approval and expected the president would authorize it. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, Casey told Jonathan to start putting together a detailed operational plan, including timelines, resource requirements, and a list of potential targets. Jonathan left the building at 10:30 and drove back to his empty house in McLean, feeling for the first time in months that he was doing something that might actually matter. Over the next several weeks, Jonathan worked with a small team of CIA officers and technical experts to develop the operational framework. They named the program Technology Transfer, Intelligence and Operations, though within the agency it would be referred to simply as the farewell operation in honor of the source who had made it possible. Jan Herring, the CIA's National Intelligence Officer for Science and Technology, was appointed to lead the effort. Herring was a career intelligence officer with a background in technical analysis and a reputation for operational pragmatism. He assembled a team that included specialists in computer science, electrical engineering, materials science, and Soviet military technology. The team worked out of a secure facility in Northern Virginia, separate from CIA headquarters to maintain operational security. Their first task was to prioritize the targets. The farewell dossier contained shopping lists with hundreds of items, far more than the agency could realistically sabotage in any reasonable time frame. The team focused on high-value technologies that would have the greatest impact on Soviet military capabilities. Computer systems and software were at the top of the list. The Soviet Union lagged far behind the United States in computer technology, and virtually every advanced Soviet weapon system depended on Western-sourced computers or components. The team identified several critical areas where sabotage technology could cause maximum disruption pipeline control systems, radar signal processing software, guidance systems for missiles and aircraft, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. One of the most significant targets was software for managing industrial control systems. The Soviets were in the process of building a massive trans-Siberian natural gas pipeline that would transport gas from fields in western Siberia to markets in Europe, generating billions of dollars in hard currency revenue that the Soviet economy desperately needed. The pipeline required sophisticated control systems to automate the operation of compressors, valves, and storage facilities across thousands of miles of remote terrain. According to the farewell material, the Soviets had been unable to develop the necessary software domestically and were actively seeking to acquire it from Western suppliers. The CIA decided to help them. Working with the National Security Agency and a Canadian software company that had been approached by Soviet procurement agents, the agency arranged for the Soviets to obtain a version of the control software they needed. The software was genuine in every respect except one. Embedded deep in the code was a logic bomb, a set of instructions that would remain dormant for a specified period and then activate, causing the system to malfunction in ways that would be difficult to diagnose or repair. The software would run normally for months, allowing the Soviets to install it, test it, and integrate it into the pipeline's operational systems. Then, at a predetermined time, the malicious code would trigger, causing pressure valves to open and close erratically, compressors to run at unsafe speeds, and safety systems to fail. The operation required extraordinary precision. The CIA could not simply hand the Soviets obviously defective software because Soviet engineers would test it thoroughly before deploying it. The sabotage had to be subtle enough to evade detection during initial testing, but catastrophic enough to cause significant damage when it activated. The team spent weeks refining the code, testing it in simulated environments, ensuring that it would function exactly as intended. By the fall of 1981, the modified software had been delivered to Soviet agents through carefully orchestrated channels that made it appear to be a successful procurement operation. The Soviets, believing they had acquired exactly what they needed, installed the software in the pipeline's control systems and began testing it in preparation for the pipeline's scheduled activation in early 1982. Jonathan monitored the operation with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The farewell program was working exactly as he had envisioned. Dozens of similar operations were underway, targeting everything from aircraft avionics to satellite components. But there was something deeply unsettling about the deliberate sabotage of industrial systems, even Soviet systems. Even in the context of the Cold War, he thought about the engineers who would be blamed when the systems failed, the officials who would be punished for allowing defective technology to be deployed, the ordinary workers whose lives might be affected by disruptions to critical infrastructure. He thought about whether there was a meaningful moral distinction between stealing technology and sabotaging it, between espionage and economic warfare. He thought about whether the ends, weakening the Soviet Union, hastening the end of the Cold War, justified the means. He did not reach any definitive conclusions. He simply continued doing his job because that was what he had been trained to do, and because he could not see any alternative that would not result in worse outcomes. On the evening of October 31st, 1982, Jonathan was at home watching the news when the telephone rang. It was Herring calling from the operations center. The pipeline had exploded. The explosion had occurred in a remote section of western Siberia, approximately 200 miles from the nearest city. Initial reports suggested it had been massive, visible from satellite reconnaissance, with a fireball that burned for hours before Soviet emergency crews could bring it under control. The damage was extensive. A significant section of the pipeline had been vaporized, and secondary explosions had damaged additional infrastructure. The Soviets would need months to repair it, and the revenue they had been counting on from gas sales to Europe would be delayed indefinitely. Herring said the agency was still confirming details, but preliminary analysis suggested the explosion had been caused by the sabotaged control software, triggering a cascading series of failures that overwhelmed the pipeline's safety systems. Pressure had built up beyond design limits, valves had failed to release it, and the resulting rupture had ignited the gas, producing an explosion that some estimates compared to a small nuclear detonation. Jonathan thanked Herring for the update and hung up the phone. He sat in his living room for a long time, staring at the television without seeing it, thinking about what had just happened. The operation had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The Soviet economy had been dealt a significant blow. The pipeline project, which had consumed enormous resources and represented a critical source of future revenue, had been set back by years. And more importantly, the Soviets had no way of knowing what had caused the explosion. They would blame faulty engineering, poor construction, inadequate safety protocols. They would investigate, assign blame, punish officials, implement new procedures, but they would not know that the explosion had been caused by software they had stolen from the West, software they had trusted, software that had been deliberately designed to destroy their infrastructure. Over the following months and years, the farewell operation expanded. The CIA conducted approximately 1,850 separate operations to feed modified technology to Soviet procurement agents. The operations targeted every major Soviet weapons program and every critical sector of the Soviet military-industrial complex. Radar systems were sabotaged with components that produced unreliable data. Computer chips were manufactured with subtle defects that caused random failures. Machinery was designed to wear out prematurely. Technical manuals were altered to contain incorrect specifications. Software was riddled with bugs that would not manifest until systems had been deployed and integrated into operational environments. The cumulative effect was exactly what Jonathan had predicted. Soviet engineers lost confidence in stolen technology. Weapons programs were delayed as systems failed unexpectedly. Resources were wasted investigating and fixing problems that had been deliberately introduced. The technological gap between the Soviet Union and the United States, which the Soviets had been working so hard to close, began to widen again. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was under severe strain. The Afghanistan war was consuming resources. The arms race with the United States was draining the budget. Agricultural production was inadequate. Consumer goods were scarce. And now, on top of everything else, the military-industrial complex was discovering that many of the technologies it had spent years acquiring from the West were unreliable or outright useless. The strain was unsustainable. In March of 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party and began implementing reforms that would ultimately lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The reforms were driven by many factors, but among them was the recognition that the Soviet economy could not compete with the West in an arms race that depended increasingly on advanced technology. The Soviet Union simply could not keep up, not when its own technological base was so weak, and not when the technologies it tried to steal from the West were increasingly compromised. Jonathan Pierce continued working for the CIA until his retirement in 1993. He never saw his wife again. Patricia filed for divorce in 1982, and the proceedings were finalized 6 months later. His daughter Emily married in 1987 and had children of her own, but she maintained minimal contact with her father, unable to forgive him for the secrets he had kept and the absences that had defined her childhood. Jonathan lived alone in the house in McLean, surrounded by classified documents he could never discuss and memories he could never share. He attended reunions of former CIA officers, exchanged occasional emails with colleagues from his years in operations, and watched as historians began writing about the end of the Cold War, trying to explain how and why the Soviet Union had collapsed. Most of those histories focused on economic factors, political failures, ideological exhaustion, and the arms race. Few mentioned the role of intelligence operations like Farewell. Few understood that the Soviet Union had been undermined not just by its own weaknesses, but by a systematic campaign of technological sabotage conducted by the CIA with extraordinary patience and precision over more than a decade. Jonathan knew the truth, but he could not tell it, not to historians, not to journalists, not even to his own family. The Farewell operation remained classified long after the end of the Cold War, its details locked away in files that would not be declassified for decades. Historians would eventually piece together fragments of the story, but the full picture would remain elusive, known only to the small number of people who had been directly involved. On the morning of November 9th, 1989, Jonathan woke to the news that the Berlin Wall had fallen. He sat in his kitchen watching the television coverage, seeing crowds of East Germans streaming through the checkpoints, celebrating in the streets, tearing down the barrier that had divided their city for 28 years. He thought about Vladimir Vetrov, the Soviet colonel whose disillusionment and courage had made the Farewell operation possible. Vetrov had been arrested by the KGB in 1982 after a personal incident unrelated to his espionage activities, tried for a common crime and sentenced to a labor camp. Soviet authorities had eventually discovered his intelligence work and executed him in January of 1985. He had died believing the Soviet system was permanent and that his betrayal had been futile. He had not lived to see the system collapse. He had not known that the intelligence he provided had contributed significantly to that collapse. He had died alone in a prison cell, forgotten by the French who had run him, and unknown to the Americans who had benefited from his courage. Jonathan thought about all the people who had played roles in the Cold War, the spies and soldiers, the diplomats and analysts, the ordinary citizens who had lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation for 4 decades. He thought about the sacrifices they had made, the lies they had told, the moral compromises they had accepted. He thought about whether it had all been worth it, whether the end of the Cold War justified the means that had been used to achieve it. He did not have an answer. He only knew that the world his daughter would raise her children in was different from the world he had grown up in, and that difference had been purchased at a cost that could never be fully calculated or adequately acknowledged. He turned off the television and went about his day, carrying with him the knowledge that history would never fully understand what had happened, that the secrets he had kept would remain secrets, and that the work he had done would never receive public recognition or proper accounting. He had helped win the Cold War by sabotaging the Soviet Union from within, by corrupting the technology they depended on, by exploiting their weaknesses and magnifying their failures. It had been effective, ruthless, and morally ambiguous. It had required him to sacrifice his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, and any hope of a normal life. And it had worked. The Soviet Union was gone. The Cold War was over. And Jonathan Pierce, sitting alone in his empty house in McLean, Virginia, was left to wonder whether that victory had been worth everything it had cost.